I had just loosened my tie after my son's wedding, when my daughter-in-law placed a thick folder on the table in front of me. Her voice was calm, too calm. She said this house no longer belonged to me. 3 days. That was all the time she gave my wife and me to move out. I looked down at the papers and saw my son's signature. The ink was still fresh, still warm. That was the moment I understood something very clearly. The wedding I had just attended was not the beginning of a family. It was the end of my silence. Before I go on, if you feel this story is worth hearing, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. And leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from. Now, let me tell you what happened right after that. I stood still in the grand hall for a long time after Sarah walked away. The door closed so softly it barely made a sound, but inside me something slammed shut. Not the house, not the property, but an assumption I had carried for many years, that my silence was enough to keep everything intact. Karen stood behind me. She didn't ask anything. We've been married for more than 40 years, long enough to know that in some moments questions only make things worse. All I could hear was the wall clock ticking. That steady rhythm felt familiar, like the sound of the shipyard every morning. Reliable, patient, but this time it sounded like a countdown. I lowered my eyes to the folder Sarah had left behind. New paper, fresh ink, cold, precise language, adjustment of ownership, transfer deadline. Not a single line about family, not a single word about the man who had lived in this house his entire life. I gently closed the folder, not because I agreed, but because I had seen enough. 5 hours earlier, I had been sitting in the front pew of the church. Daniel stood there, back straight, eyes bright, his hand holding Sarah's. I thought I was looking at happiness. I told myself maybe I had been too cautious, too suspicious, and that my generation needed to step back. I believed that, until I stepped into the back hallway to check my phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I stopped because I heard my name. Sarah's voice then was nothing like it had been during the ceremony. Not soft, not trembling. She spoke fast, sharp, certain. Vince let out a quiet laugh. I remember the sentence clearly because of how calm it was. He already signed. We just wait until after the ceremony, and it's done. I didn't step out. I didn't make a scene. I leaned against the cold stone wall and let every word pass through me. They talked about the power of attorney like it was a small object misplaced. They talked about Daniel as a necessary condition, nothing more. And they talked about me like an old door, one that only needed the right way to open. When I returned to the ceremony, Daniel looked at me and smiled. I smiled back, not because I wasn't hurting, but because I needed to be sure. Throughout the reception, I watched more than I spoke. Every time someone mentioned me, Sarah would place her hand on Daniel's arm. A small gesture, but a controlling one. I had seen that before in technical drawings with subtle misalignments only an engineer would notice. After the ceremony, while the guests were still around, Sarah changed. She stopped playing the bride. She stopped keeping her distance. She walked straight into my house like an inspector at a site visit. Looked around, nodded. Then right in front of me, she placed the folder on the table. No hesitation, no explanation. She believed everything was already finished. What caught my attention wasn't her boldness. It was the look in her eyes when I didn't react. She was waiting for anger, for shouting, for collapse. But I've spent my life with the sea. I know storms don't need to scream. When Sarah left, I didn't follow her. I didn't call Daniel back either. I needed time to put everything back in its proper place. I sat down in the old wooden chair by the window. The chair I had repaired with my own hands after the storm 15 years ago. I remember that day clearly. Daniel was still a boy, watching me work, asking why I didn't just buy a new one. I told him some things don't need replacing. They just need understanding. Karen sat across from me. She rested her hand lightly on the table. We still have a home, she said. Not as a statement, as a reminder. I nodded. Yes, we still had a home, and memories, and years Sarah knew nothing about. She thought my silence was emptiness, but to me, it was where I stored everything that mattered. That night, after everyone had gone, I opened the safe in my study, not to take out money, but to check something else. Old documents, decisions I had signed a long time ago, when Daniel was still in high school. I did it not because I doubted my son, but because I understood that life doesn't run on trust alone. I closed the safe, and sat in the dark for a long time. Outside, the Seattle rain began to fall. Soft, steady. I knew then. From the moment Sarah placed that folder on the table, this story was no longer about a wedding. It was about who thought they held the power, and who was truly waiting for the right moment to open the door. The next morning, Sarah began playing the role of someone who cared. No announcement, no asking for permission. She showed up in the kitchen early, wearing a light sweater, holding a cup of coffee, as if she had belonged to this house for years. Daniel stood beside her, nodding at me out of habit. That was when I realized something. From that moment on, everything would be said in a low voice, slow, always paired with a look of fake concern. "Dad should take his medication on time," Sarah said, placing a familiar box in front of me. I stared at it for a long moment. It looked exactly like the one I used. The label, Karen's handwriting. Everything was right. Everything. Except one small detail. The smell. Very faint. But to me it was different. I didn't say anything. I took it as usual. Not because I trusted her, but because I needed to be sure. All that day, Sarah stayed in the house longer than necessary. She rearranged a few things, moved some items around, and she was always nearby whenever I stood up. The way she watched wasn't care, it was inspection. In the afternoon, Daniel pulled me out to the back porch. My son spoke slowly, choosing every word, like he was talking to someone who forgot easily. He said Sarah was worried about my health, that I had worked too long, that it was time for some support. I listened. I nodded. I didn't argue, because I realized that in my son's eyes, I had already started becoming a different version of myself. That night, Karen asked if I felt tired. I said yes. It wasn't a lie. I was tired of pretending not to see what was happening inside my own home. Tired of every gesture of concern carrying another purpose. 2 days later, new devices appeared. A health tracking watch. Small sensors placed near the bed. Sarah said it was for peace of mind. Daniel agreed almost immediately. I noticed Sarah's eyes when I didn't object. Not relief, satisfaction. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of the devices, but because of the whispers coming from my study. I stood behind the half-closed door and heard Sarah's voice. Low, even. She was on the phone. I couldn't catch every word, but it was enough to understand one thing. The plan didn't stop with paperwork. The next morning, I checked the medication again. I didn't change anything. I only observed. I let Karen drink her coffee first, then I drank mine. Nothing happened right away, but by noon, my head felt heavier than usual. Not pain, just slower. As if someone had turned the volume of the world down, just a little. I sat at the table and opened an old notebook. I started writing everything down. The time I took the medication, the way Sarah spoke. When Daniel appeared, I wasn't writing to accuse. I was writing to stay awake. That afternoon, Sarah invited someone to the house. She introduced him as a support specialist. He asked me simple questions. Dates, street names. I answered correctly, but slower than usual on purpose. I wanted to see what he wrote. When he left, Sarah let out a very soft breath. She thought she had moved one step forward. That night I removed the tracking watch. I didn't throw it away. I didn't break it. I gently opened the back. I had worked with more delicate equipment than this for years. Inside was a small component, enough to record sound at close range. I put it back together and placed it where it was before. Only one thing was different now. It wouldn't be listening to just me. In the days that followed, Sarah talked more about nursing homes. Not directly. She told stories about quiet places, places with caregivers, safe for older people. Daniel stayed silent every time. He avoided looking at me. That hurt the most. I didn't push back. I kept writing things down. I kept taking the medication, but I adjusted the dose in my own way. I needed my mind clear enough not to reveal the change. My silence made Sarah more confident. She started speaking louder in the house, started discussing more when she thought I couldn't hear. One evening after Karen had gone to bed, I sat in my study and played back the first recordings. Sarah's voice came through clearly. No editing, no interpretation, just the truth. Bare and exposed. Spoken when she believed she was in control. I sat there for a long time, not to feel pleased, but to prepare. I understood that from this point on, every mistake could be used against me. I was no longer the silent father. I had become living evidence, and I needed to move more carefully than ever. Outside, the rain kept falling. I looked out the window and thought about Daniel. I wasn't angry at my son. I was just sad. And inside that sadness, I knew I had one last thing to do, to make sure my son would not wake up one day inside a story that had already been written by someone else. I didn't tell Karen about the recordings right away, not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to keep a small pocket of silence in this house. Sarah had begun controlling the atmosphere in every room. Karen only had to look into my eyes to know that something was slipping out of its familiar alignment. A few days later, Vince showed up. Sarah introduced him as an old friend, her voice so gentle it almost sounded harmless. He wore a dark suit, not too new, not too worn, the kind of clothing worn by someone who wants to blend into any room. He shook my hand firmly and looked straight at me, as if checking whether I was still clear enough to remember his face. Daniel was there. My son nodded at Vince without hesitation. I saw that. And something opened up inside me. Not because of Vince, but because my son had accepted his presence too quickly. They talked in the living room, voices kept just low enough. Words like restructuring strategic partners and asset optimization came up more often than necessary. I sat at the dining table nearby, pretending to read the paper. I didn't need to hear everything. I only needed to hear enough. My shipyard was mentioned for the first time that afternoon, not as a legacy, but as a burden. Vince said the market was changing. Sarah said keeping the yard for emotional reasons was not practical. Daniel stayed silent. He didn't object, and that silence weighed more than any words. That night, I went down to the yard alone. The smell of wood, old oil, and familiar metal slowed my breathing. I built that place when Daniel still couldn't read. Every vessel that left carried a piece of my life with it. And now, it was being placed on the table like a product. The next morning I found a stack of papers on my work desk. Not openly displayed, not centered in the room, just placed so I would accidentally see it. A contract. Not the original, a copy, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. My name. My handwriting. Too familiar. I held the papers for a long time. I didn't shake. I just felt cold. Not from fear, but from realizing they had gone further than I thought. The signature had been copied carefully. Whoever did it understood my habits, understood them too well. I didn't take the papers back into the house. I put them right where they were. I needed them to believe I hadn't noticed anything. Instead, I opened the notebook I had started days earlier. I wrote down the date, the time, names, exact words as closely as I could remember. No emotion, no assumptions, just record. That afternoon, Vince came back. This time he brought someone else, introduced as a broker. The man avoided my eyes. His gaze passed over me and moved on quickly. I had seen this type before back in my contract days. They're only comfortable when things stay unclear. Sarah said they wanted to resolve things early to avoid complications. I asked what complications meant. She smiled and said, I didn't need to worry. When someone tells you not to worry, that's usually when you should worry the most. Daniel pulled me aside on the porch. He said everyone was just trying to help, that the shipyard was too much for an older man. I looked at my son for a long time. I saw a child in an adult's body, repeating what had been fed to him. I wanted to ask if he remembered falling asleep on the drafting table in the yard, but I didn't. That night, I played the recordings again. Vince's voice came through more clearly than I expected. He talked about price, timing, about how the old man won't understand. Sarah laughed softly. Not loud, but enough to make everything clear. I wasn't angry. I was sad. Sad that Daniel was standing in the middle without knowing it. Sad that I hadn't taught my son how to recognize when care turns into conditions. In the days that followed, I moved more carefully. I backed everything up. I kept the originals where only I knew. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. I needed them more confident. I needed them to take a few more steps, right into the trap they believed I couldn't see. One morning, Sarah said I should rest more. She suggested I limit my trips to the yard. I nodded. I said I was tired. That part was true, just not in the way they thought. That afternoon, I sat alone in my study looking out at the sea. I opened the notebook again and wrote on a fresh page, the day everything was placed on the table. Not the day they betrayed me, but the day they believed I had let go. I knew that from the moment Vince walked into this house, the story had shifted into another phase. No more whispers, no more small arrangements. It had become a negotiation, and I, still silent, was standing in the middle of the board waiting for the right moment to move a single piece. I chose that dinner not because of emotion, but because of timing. The rain had finally stopped after days of falling, and Seattle was wrapped in a rare quiet. I told Daniel I wanted the whole family to sit down and speak clearly about the future. I used the exact words Sarah always used. Clear, stable, no dragging things out. Sarah agreed almost immediately. She even offered to cook dinner. It sounded friendly, but to me it was a sign of too much confidence. When people think they've already won, they stop keeping their distance. I sent the invitation simply. No explanations. Just enough to bring everyone to the table. Sarah arrived early as usual. She looked around the dining room, checking the lighting, the chairs, the position of the table. I realized she had already started seeing this place as hers. Vince was not invited. That made Sarah hesitate for half a second. But she didn't ask. She believed it was no longer necessary. Daniel arrived last. My son looked tired. I could see it clearly. Over the past few days, he had been pulled between conflicting voices. I looked at him and understood that if I didn't end this the right way, he would carry it for a very long time. Dinner went on as if it were normal. The food was hot. Cutlery touched softly. Sarah talked about long-term plans. She spoke as if everything had already been agreed upon. I let her talk. I nodded in a few places. I kept the pace slow, the way I always did with the sea when it grew restless. When dessert was served, I placed an envelope on the table. Not large, not thick. Sarah saw it immediately. Her eyes lit up for a brief second, then returned to normal. She thought it was what she had been waiting for. "I've been thinking," I said. My voice was even, not raised, not low. "About what you've been proposing." Daniel looked at me. He waited. Sarah smiled. Just slightly. I opened the envelope. But I didn't take out any papers. Instead, I placed a small device on the table, and I pressed a button. Sarah's voice filled the room. Not loud, but clear. A soft laugh. Sentences that sounded harmless on their own, but when stitched together, formed a picture no one could deny. She talked about speeding things up, about how he wouldn't notice, about Daniel as a condition to get through. No one spoke. Daniel stiffened in his chair. I didn't look at him. I let him hear it for himself. I let the silence do its work. Sarah stood up. Her chair scraped back a little too hard. She said it was a misunderstanding, that the recordings were edited, that I wasn't well and had misheard. She spoke very fast, too fast. I placed another device on the table. This time it was Vince's voice, talking about the shipyard, about price, about signatures. No laughter, no disguise, just raw calculation. Sarah fell silent. This silence was different from the ones before. It wasn't strategy. It was the sound of having nowhere left to stand. At that moment, the dining room door opened. My lawyer walked in. He wasn't in a hurry. He greeted everyone politely, then placed another stack of papers on the table. He explained that all the contracts being discussed were invalid, that the shipyard and the house had been placed into a trust many years ago, that no recent signature could change that. Sarah looked at the documents, then at me. For the first time, there was no control in her eyes. She asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told her I wanted to see how far she would go. Daniel stood up. He asked me why. I looked at my son. I told him I needed to know who was standing beside him for family, and who was standing there for something else. I said, "The truth needs to be seen, not explained." The lawyer added a few more words, about stored evidence, about actions that lacked transparency. He spoke calmly. No accusations, no threats. Just facts placed where they belonged. Sarah left right after that. No goodbye, no looking back. The room became strangely quiet. I heard the wall clock again, that familiar rhythm, as if it had never stopped. Daniel sat back down, his head lowered. I didn't say anything more. I knew that from this moment on he needed time. And so did I. I looked out the window. It was fully dark now. The sea outside was completely still. I knew that dinner wasn't the end, but it was the moment when every mask had been placed on the table, and no one could pretend anymore that they hadn't seen them. After that dinner, the house grew quiet in a different way. Not the forced kind of silence, but the kind of space things need to settle. I didn't go to sleep right away. I sat in my study with the lights off, leaving only the glow from the window. The sea was still there, steady and calm, as if it hadn't witnessed anything that had just happened inside this house. The days that followed moved slowly. My lawyer did his part. I didn't need to be present much. The evidence spoke for itself. The recordings, the clumsily copied documents, the signs of interference with medication, all placed where they belonged. I didn't feel happy when I heard everything was being clarified. I just felt lighter, like when the wind finally shifts after days of heavy air. Sarah didn't come back. I heard she was being asked to explain several matters at once. No loud scenes, no public accusations, just doors quietly closing in front of her. The same with Vince. I didn't follow what happened to them. I didn't need to. Every life has its own trajectory, and I chose to step away from theirs. Daniel stayed. My son didn't say much. In the mornings, he came into the kitchen earlier, made coffee for Mom, then sat across from me without speaking. I let him be silent. Some lessons don't need words. A week later, I handed Daniel an old set of protective gear. The sleeves were worn at the cuffs. The helmet had a small scratch. He looked at me surprised. I told him that if he wanted to understand what I had built, he should start where everything began. Not on paper, but with his hands. The first day at the yard, Daniel was awkward. He was used to drafting tables, screens, perfect straight lines. Here, nothing is perfect at the start. Wood has grain. Metal has weight. Every mistake leaves a mark. I didn't give many instructions. I just stayed nearby, enough for him to know I was there. Karen came by at noon with a simple meal. She looked at us without saying anything, but her eyes softened. I realized I had neglected moments like this for too long, moments that don't require proof or defense. In the days that followed, Daniel began asking questions, not about money, not about ownership. He asked why I chose this type of wood, why a weld needs time. I answered simply. I didn't teach him through lectures. I let him feel it for himself. One afternoon, Daniel stopped working and said he was sorry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple sentence. I nodded. I didn't say everything was fine. I said things were moving in the right direction. For me, that was enough. As for the assets, I kept my decision. The trust stayed as it was. I didn't use it to punish. I used it to protect the yard, the house. And Daniel, from rushed choices in the future, he understood that slowly. But I could see that he did. One rare, clear morning, I walked out to the shore. No phone, no notebook. I stood there listening to the waves, and realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not for an apology, not for recognition. I had taken back the most important thing, the right to be at peace in my own life. That evening, we ate dinner together. No talk of the past, no big plans, just small stories. Karen talked about the garden. Daniel talked about a detail in the yard he finally got right after many mistakes. I listened, and I felt myself smile, quietly. Before going to bed, I opened the window in my study. The sea wind came in carrying that familiar scent of salt. I thought about that wedding, about the folder placed on the table, about the silence that had once been mistaken for weakness. I understood then. Silence is only dangerous when it hides the truth. But when silence waits for the right moment to speak, it becomes strength. This story doesn't end with a victory. It ends with a return to values that can't be signed away, a return to work, to responsibility, to family in its truest sense. I closed the window, turned off the light, and for the first time in a long while, I slept a full, peaceful sleep. If you stayed until the end of this story, thank you. If it gave you something to think about, please tap like to support it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and share it. If you believe someone else needs to hear this, the lesson I took from all of this is simple. Money can change many things, but it can't replace kindness, honest work, or responsibility to family. And silence is not always weakness. Sometimes, it's how we hold on to what truly matters. Thank you for listening.